Welcome to Rules of the Pit. We have with us Larry Livermore, founder of the well-known punk rock record label Lookout Records, a label forever locked in punk rock history. Author of Spy Rock Memories and, unironically, How to Ruin a Record Label, the story of Lookout Records. Thank you, Larry, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's very exciting to be here.
Larry, hi, I'm Churchy, and
You
I
say
guess I just
churchy?
wanted to kind of kick
Did
this
you, I'm
off by
sorry.
asking,
Yeah, let
I'm
me
a comic book
Ho-
fan, and
Hold on, Joe. Hold on.
just be sure I caught your name right. Churchy?
well,
Yep.
Upchurch is my last name, but my nickname amongst the boys here is Churchy. Chef
Okay,
Brady
no,
actually gave me that
I'm not
nickname.
trying to bag on you. I just wanted to make sure I had your name right.
Oh no, you're good, you're good,
Okay, what's the
absolutely.
question?
But I'm a comic book fan, and I enjoy a good origin story, whether it be about Wolverine or like the Legion of Superheroes from DC Comics. So I was just kind of curious, what's your punk rock origin story, or just like what led you to where you are now?
Well, all you guys are fairly young fellows, and you may not be totally aware that the word punk has been around a lot longer than the punk rock scene, and it originally had different meanings. For one of the meanings was that you were somebody's sexual in prison. You were somebody's sexual possession. And another one was just what later became like a wimp or something, somebody that got pushed around. Also, like a wannabe tough guy was a punk, like if you were in a gang and stuff, but you were kind of the little guy with the big mouth that always annoyed everybody. All of those things, when I was a kid, that's what punk meant. And in 1957, when I was 9 years old, almost 10, um, there was a craze, believe it or not, for kids all over the country to get a mohawk haircut. And it was because of a Disney show called Last of the Mohicans, the Mohican being the other name for mohawk. And so I was one of the only kids in the neighborhood, the only kid in the neighborhood whose dad let him get a mohawk. And I thought I was pretty cool. And I was walking down the street by the school and with my little brother, and I was trying to show off how big and tough I was. I was not big and tough. I was a very scrawny little kid with a big mouth. And this other kid comes along on the sidewalk and he won't get out of the way. And I, of course, am the big tough, well, in my mind, the big tough guy. So I'm not going to get out of the way either. And I just keep walking towards him, and he just takes me and pushes me off the sidewalk. Says, "Get out of the way, punk." And that was the first time I got called a punk. And I did not know that I was planting a seed for my future. But it was very humiliating. I felt like my little brother would never respect me again. And I'm not sure if he does to this day. But anyway, I guess that's when it first got into my head that I was a punk. Is it was when well, we first in Detroit where I lived, we first started hearing the term punk rock about 1969 or 70. There was a writer called Lester Bangs who used to write for Cream magazine, and he started using it all the time to talk about the MC5 who were from my neighborhood and the Stooges who were from a nearby city. And so it just kind of grew from there. So by the time like the mass media discovered punk rock in 1976 and 77, it was kind of almost like old news. But at the same time, I was like, oh yeah, I've been here all along.
Wow, I didn't know people were getting mohawks all the way back then.
It was nothing really to do with the punk rock mohawk. It was to do with this TV show
Hmm.
that had been really popular. Like Disney was a new thing at that time. Yeah, back then there was only three channels, so basically everybody was watching the same stuff. And the hero of the show had a mohawk, so all the little kids wanted to have one too. But most parents had more sense than to let their kids have one. My dad was kind of halfway. He didn't shave it completely on the sides, but cut it really, really short. Yeah. Uh, So I thought it was cool. But yeah, it's just kind of extra ironic that I got called a punk when I was wearing a mohawk. But honestly, it had nothing to do with the future. It was more about Native Americans or Indians, as they more commonly said back then.
Punk rock came out of the, this is, the post Vietnam, it was kind of a surge after that. And there was a lot of hullabaloo about everything political when it first came out for most bands. Like, you got Dead Kennedys that early on, they started political. But with you, how did did any of that have anything to do with forming your opinion when you came into the punk rock scene? And when did that really start for you?
Well, I mean, Dead Kennedys is old school for a lot of people, but for me, they came along later. I mean, my first opinions were from the MC5 and the Stooges. I mean, MC5, the first time I saw them was 1964 or 65, and we didn't really call them punk rock yet, and they didn't get political until the end of the 60s, like 67, 68. But the kind of political stuff that got associated with the punks later on, like in the late 70s, yeah, that was very different. And it also it differed very much from one place to another. Like whether if you were in the punk scene in New York or London, it was very different than the punk scene in San Francisco and Berkeley. Because like San Francisco and Berkeley had always had a long tradition of leftist politics. And so that kind of just merged right in to the new punk scene. Whereas in New York and London and Los Angeles too, punk was more about just, I'm against it. Well, there's a great Ramones song, I'm against it. And then they just list off everything in the world and then they hate it all. They're against it all. I mean, the initial politics of punk rock to people that I knew, even in California, where I was at the time, was basically to piss off the hippies, to say we're sick of everything all being nicey and kind of hypocritical and fake and stuff. So we're just gonna turn everything upside down, and black is white and up is down, just to be different and to be annoying. There was also the aspect of music by that time had gotten very grandiose, like great big, the progressive rock bands. It was almost like a symphony orchestra and stuff, and so bringing music back to basics. But the whole political thing kind of developed gradually. I mean, if you listen to California Über Alles, which was the first big thing that the Dead Kennedys did, that was more aimed at the hippies and the liberals than it was at the right wing. In fact, it wasn't aimed at the right wing at all. It was aimed at the governor of California, Jerry Brown, who was actually a very futuristic minded, all about solar power and the environment, like years ahead of his time. But because he was too nice and not radical enough, the Dead Kennedys were like, oh, Jello Biafra basically was like, he's the enemy, not the fascists, not the, as you probably know, a few years later, Ronald Reagan got elected, and then the Dead Kennedys changed that song to "We Got a Bigger Problem Now." But I was kind of like, you had a chance to get a reasonably liberal guy like 4 years ago to be president, and you spent all your time attacking him, and then now you're surprised that there's this like extreme right-wing guy in charge. It's been the story of politics all my life. Like the really hardcore hippies or punks, they're like, I'm not going to support that person unless they're like out on the barricades and overthrowing the government. And then because they won't support that moderately progressive person, a real right-wing fascist gets in, and then they're like, it's not fair. We have how could the fascists take over like that? Well, you helped him because you wouldn't support the other side. Yeah, that's my view. Not everybody agrees with me. Some people say, oh, all or nothing. It's going to be all my way or nothing, and usually you get nothing. Anyway, that's what I think of punk politics. A lot of what we think of as being part of punk politics from the start came out of Tim Yohannan and Maximum Rock and Roll, and he was an old hippie and left winger and communist basically from the East Coast who moved to California and kind of got really into Bay Area protest politics. And he, more than probably any other person, helped kind of develop the idea that punk was about politics, left-wing politics and protest. And, you know, in a lot of ways, he accomplished a lot that way and helped a lot of people really develop themselves and their ideas. But at the same time, because he had very rigid ideas, in a way, he kind of was his own worst enemy too. So, kind of like a lot of great men, he was, you know, had a vision, but he was tragically flawed.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So sort of bringing up the Bay Area, and so when you guys were starting Lookout Records at the time, you know, one of the other names that comes to mind is 924 Gilman and the whole Gilman Street crew. So was there much influence on your ethics? You know, the ethics that came out of Gilman was sort of in reaction to the hardcore scene at the time. Did that influence you at Lookout at all, or in how you handled
Very,
Lookout?
very much so. But I should. There's a little bit of a side note. You know, people almost always now say 924 Gilman, but that actually was a later name. Originally, it was the Gilman Street Project, the Gilman Street Warehouse, or mostly to us, it was just Gilman. But then when the aforementioned Tim Yohannan, who was a big supporter and backer, a financial backer of the original Gilman, he became dissatisfied with the direction it was going, thinking it was no longer political enough. And so he shut it down, thinking that was the end of it. He never dreamed that it would go on without him. And a few weeks later, a bunch of people got together and restarted it, opened it up again. And that's when the name 924 Gilman started coming into use. You know, the culture and the philosophy did not change that much. It was just a little bit more relaxed. Like with Tim, it was like every time he came in, it's like, oh, Dad's home. You know, like Gilman Street it was like, I remember it feeling like it was, you know, like in a lot of neighborhoods, there will be like one family where the cool parents let the kids hang out in the basement or the rec room or stuff and do whatever they want within reason. And that's kind of what Gilman was like. You know, you'd go there and all your friends would be there and you could just goof around and be crazy and loud and stuff, and nobody would mess with you. But you know, when Tim would walk in, it was like a lot like Dad came in and like, all right, kids, hold it down a little, you know, just keep it in order. And so once Tim was gone from Gilman, you know, the same principle. I mean, he had done a very good job of setting up the foundation of it, the basic principles, which, I mean, they're still written on the wall by the door to this very day. And people are just kind of, they follow it without thinking almost, just because and most of them make very good sense. But it was a little bit more relaxed. People felt a little bit more free to bend the rules once in a while and, you know, question things. But basically, Gilman went on and has continued to go on with essentially the same principles that it started with. And you know, getting back to your original question, yes, that affected Lookout immensely. I mean, we considered ourselves basically an outgrowth of Gilman and the East Bay punk scene and the whole Bay Area thing in California. It was just like, it helped us a lot, but in a way it kind of hurt us, because it also hurt us. Because I was unwilling to be quite as businesslike as I probably should have been. And I mean, nobody likes to think about being businesslike in terms of running a cool label, but you know, the facts of life are that if you want to do some kind of great thing, whether it's found a revolution or a new country or a new society or a record label or club or whatever, you have to have at least enough of a sound financial footing to keep going. If you can't pay the rent, if you can't pay the bills, you know, you're going to be gone, no matter how cool what you're doing is. And that is what happens to most punk things sooner or later, because, oh man, I don't care about money, I just want to play my music. Well, you got to care enough, you know, not excessively, but enough to at least pay the bills. You don't need to get rich. In fact, that getting rich often gets in the way, but not, you know, being deliberately, desperately poor means you're going to end up spending all your time just trying to survive rather than do cool stuff. And I think what I don't know, we did really well for quite a while, but once the whole punk thing became like a big commercial thing as well, in order for us to continue, we did need to be a little bit more practical. And it was, even though Tim and I eventually fell out, it was almost always like he was sitting on my shoulder saying, "Oh, you can't do that. That's not cool. That's not punk. That's, you know." And in effect, and eventually he did kind of denounce us and say we were no longer punk because we were too popular. You know, basically, I wish somebody would have wrote this down in the rule book, but it felt like, you know, there was a certain number of records you could sell before you were a sellout. And I think it was somewhere in between 2,000 and 3,000, maybe 5,000 tops, but which, you know, it didn't make sense. If you were a good band and you made a record and a bunch of people wanted to buy it, you know, my philosophy was, well, then everybody that wants it should be able to buy it. But sometimes, like a band comes along like Operation Ivy, and suddenly, you know, everybody that hears them wants to get that record. And, you know, either you stop making records and they break up or they go to another label, or you press a bunch more records, and the next thing you know, you're kind of a big company. You're doing 10,000, 20,000, 50, 100,000 records, and Tim Yohannan is like, you're getting too corporate. I mean, we were doing all this out of a room that looked about the size and shape of where some of you are sitting right now. Like you, Churchy, that your room looks about the size of the Lookout Records office. And yes, I didn't have a bed. I just had a bunch of blankets piled up in the corner.
Yeah.
That was the Lookout Records enterprise, you know, international headquarters, where we sold millions of records from a room that size. But at the same time, people were yelling at us and saying, "Oh, you corporate sellouts." The rent was, by the way, was $98 a month.
Dang.
Jeez.
And you know, I tried eventually, when things started getting better, I tried to rent an apartment in the neighborhood, because it was like too crazy. There was 3 people working full time there, and then a 4th person came, and it was hardly room to move, and let alone live there as well. I didn't even have a refrigerator because the refrigerator broke, and it was all full of tapes of 2-inch, you know, the real tapes that master tapes. And I went around to the different apartments in the neighborhood, and this one guy, he says, "I've got a nice apartment for you." And I told him my story, and then I come back to pick up the keys, and he said, "You know, I'm not going to rent to you because I went by that place where you said you're running your business, and there's no way you're selling millions of dollars of records out of that dump. I think everything you say must be a lie." So I never got the apartment.
It's crazy. But
I had to keep sleeping on the floor.
so you touched on the business side with you guys at the label end, but how difficult was it to push the bands in that direction financially? You know, hey guys, you can't just play to have fun. You know, we still have to build a business out of this.
I mentioned this in my book, and I think it's a very important factor, because it was one of my biggest and toughest jobs. Like getting the money, selling the records, that part came surprisingly easy. I think obviously because the music was so good, but dealing with the different kinds of personalities. Now there were some bands that were very practical and sensible, and that you know, they didn't want to necessarily be rock stars, but they wanted to make a living from their music because, as some of them put it, well, I don't know how to do anything else. If I didn't do this, I would have to be a dishwasher or a street sweeper because it's basically all I know. And in two of our biggest bands, that was the case. I mean, they literally barely finished high school and didn't really have any other skills except playing music, but their skill at playing music was like out of this world. So there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to make a living. And those guys, you know, they thought about it and they took some normal kind of sensible precautions. But many of the others, especially the ones that kind of grew up in more middle class families, and they were like, oh yeah, la la la, just a goof, you know, next year I'll go back to college, or next year I'll get a job somewhere else, and that was a little frustrating. But probably the worst was the people who had the talent to have a career in music, but they just didn't want to think about it. Like, oh, money, you know, money's gross. I don't. And I warned them, and then this came true in a number of cases. I say, if you don't take this seriously, there's going to come a time 5-10 years from now when you're like in your 30s or your 40s, and you're going to have a house, maybe a family, you're going to have bills to pay, and you're going to have nothing, and you're going to be really pissed off, and you're going to feel like all this pressure to do all sorts of shit you don't want to do just because you didn't take care of business back in the early days. And that I saw that break up a lot of bands, just because they, like, you know, they'll be like, oh, you can't make a living doing this stuff. Well, yeah, you can if you use the same common sense that you would do with any other career. It doesn't mean you have to take the joy out of playing music. It just means that, you know, you write down when you play shows, you write down how much you got paid, and if you're not getting paid enough, you figure out how you're gonna get paid a little bit more, and you make sure that everybody in the band is getting a fair share, and so that they don't get pissed off or angry at like one guy getting all the glory and the cash. Just the simplest things, you know. It's not a lot to it. Just to have a little back then, before computers even, like, they just have a little notebook where you write things down, and some of them just didn't want to do it. And sure enough, you know, 20 years later, they're like, this whole scene sucks, you know, there's blah blah blah, and you know, some great music was either lost or at least, you know, very hindered in its ability to get out to the world because of that.
So, talking about that, the music world in 2022 is fundamentally different than when you started Lookout Records. The internet's given bands easier access to self-promotion and self-publishing than ever before. Is there anything that the music industry or even bands seem to have forgotten with all this ease of access?
Well, the one thing that I think it's forgotten is the same thing it always forgets, is that everything constantly changes. And if you try to plan your business or your art around how things worked when you were younger, well, you're probably going to mess yourself up, because, I mean, you know, when people say, oh, the internet, oh, blah, blah, you know, ruins everything. You know, when I was a little kid, there was no 33 RPM records. There was no stereo records. I mean, there was no albums. There was no independent distribution. There was, like, basically a completely different world. And, you know, the idea, for instance, what we did, like, our first records were a bunch of 7-inches, where I went down and Xeroxed a bunch of papers, covers, and put them into plastic bags. Well, when I was younger, there was no such thing as Xerox machines. It was, you know, if you wanted to print something, you would have to pay some printer really a ton of money, so much so that you could never have made money selling the record. It would have cost $10 a piece. You know, so yeah, things change, like technology changed a lot that make it possible for us I learned that in the early 80s when I started my magazine, Lookout magazine. It, a few years earlier, it just probably would not have been possible because, again, no Xerox machines. I could, I could never have afforded to pay a printer to do a professional magazine. I mean, it might have looked a lot better, but, what's the point if it can't exist? So, and same with like cheap cassette recorders. And they didn't exist before the late 60s. So, being able to make your own demo, like starting with the Lookouts, I mean, we would set up a cassette recorder in the corner while we practiced. And, it wasn't good enough to put out or release or anything, but it was good enough to get an idea how we sounded and how we were screwing up. Again, stuff that didn't exist. So if you can't adjust to changes, you're probably in the wrong field. You should probably find maybe you should be a farmer where things basically, well, even farming doesn't stay the same. But I was going to say, like, you just go out there and dig up the dirt and throw some seeds in. But of course, that's for most farmers, that's no longer true either. You got big machines and got big corporations to deal with, and that's the way it is. I mean, you can spend all your time bitching and moaning about how it's not fair, or I don't want progress, or lack of progress, whatever you want to call it. But that's just, you kind of have to deal with life as it is, not how you wish it was.
You're talking about almost like basic evolution. I mean, that's, you either adapt or you be overcome.
Well, yeah, adapt or die. Yes, I wrote a science fiction novel back in the 70s called Mutate or Die. It was basically a apocalyptic world disaster where only a handful of people survived, and the ones who survived were in fact the ones that both mentally, physically, and spiritually were able to evolve or adapt to new conditions.
Mhm.
Everybody else just kind of like, well, they were gone.
So, Churchy, what's that you got sitting right there?
Oh, this little thing right here. This belongs to my girlfriend, Miss Megan Deskins, and Larry. She has been a huge, like,
That name
look
sounds
out
familiar.
everything.
That name
Band.
sounds familiar.
It's-
Megan.
Yeah.
Is
And,
that the original or the repress?
This is an original.
Oh,
Mm-hmm. And
I never-
she was just curious, like,
apparently
much
that's
fun was it to make this?
Apparently that's worth money now. I never dreamed I would see that day. We had trouble selling them all in the first couple of years. What were you going to say about it?
Oh, she was just curious, because that's our fan question that we do in one of these episodes. How much fun was it to make Spy Rock Road here, or was there any just like the recording process, all that?
It was mostly fun, but it was a little bit stressful too, because this was at the same time Operation Ivy were making their record at the same time and in the same studio, and it was the time when everything was starting to look like it might be a lot bigger deal than we ever thought it was. For the first year or so, we kind of just thought, well, as long as we can sell enough 7-inches to pay the bills and make some more 7-inches, then everything's great. But by that time, some of the records were starting to actually make some money, and especially Operation Ivy. And somehow I got it into my head, like, well, if they're making a record right now that's going to be a big deal, well, we're making a record, why shouldn't that be a big deal too? Sort of overlooking the fact that we didn't have quite as much talent as they did. So I tended to get very high strung. The other guys in the band were quite a bit younger, and they were more like, woohoo, we're kids in a recording studio. This is like enormous fun. But I was more like, no, we got to do this perfect. So blah, blah, blah. It would have been a lot better record if I had just relaxed a little. That was true of almost every record I've ever been on. But it was also the first record we made where, we had some we had a good recording engineer, Kevin Army, and we had, learned to play our instruments enough that we could do some cool stuff that we wouldn't have been able to do a year or two earlier. So, and the other complicating factor was because Lookout was starting to get to be a big deal, I had to spend a lot of time dealing with the record label and I was kind of juggling being in the studio and writing songs and running the record label. It's a funny thing, like the other bands tend to get jealous if you spend too much time on your own band. I don't know if that's fair or not, but I did run into conflicts at times like that. But one of my favorite memories from that record, I was still not that well. I've never been that great of a lead guitarist, and I was not that confident in my ability. So I brought in Lint, or Tim Armstrong, as he's known now, to do solos on a couple of the songs, and the one is called "Living Behind Bars," which came out really well, I thought, and it's kind of a little bit inspired by Operation Ivy, and also it's about going to visit Jesse from Operation Ivy at his house in a bad neighborhood in Oakland, and it came off pretty good. But I mean, Tim or Lint was so excited when we finished, because at this time Op Ivy had not yet become like really huge, and he was still very excited just about the idea of being on a record. So it was like middle of the night when we finished it, and we ran down to where his brother worked in a 7-Eleven, in an all-night 7-Eleven, and put it on the stereo there and played it like really loud a bunch of times. Like Tim is like, "Jeff, check this out. I'm on a record. Check this out." And it did. It really sounded great. And that was like one of the high points of making that record, just to, jumping around the 7-Eleven at 2 in the morning listening to this music that we had made. One thing I love about Tim is he's, all these years later, what is it, like 30, some years, or more than 30 years later, he still has that same excitement. He does all these different projects in addition to Rancid, where, like Tim Time Bomb and his friend, where he just gets a bunch of musicians together and does all these, sometimes covers, sometimes originals, sometimes classic country song. And it just does it because he loves playing music. And that's just how he always was. And even if he's a big rock star now and pretty famous and all that, he's, nothing gets in the way of his just really loving music. And I imagine, I don't see him that often, sometimes only once every year or two, but I imagine he still probably jumps around and says, "Hey, check this record out. I'm on a record. Check how it sounds."
That's awesome. Larry, which Lookout band would you say, in your opinion, was probably like the most underrated?
This, I always get this, but the two most underrated were Brent's TV and Nuisance. Kind of not really very similar to each other, and a lot of people would say, "Oh yeah, they're just," especially Brent's TV, "they're too unusual or too weird. You can't expect them to get too popular." But they were both very important to me because they both reflected the northern, not the Bay Area, but farther up north in Humboldt kind of culture, where that was like the whole story of Lookout, was to try to give a voice to local scenes and cultures that might never get heard otherwise. And I was so proud of both of those bands because they did that. They're not that different, but they're different enough. That kind of music never would have come out of anywhere else but Northern California, Humboldt. And I knew Brent's TV would probably only, the people who do love them really, really love them. But I knew that would probably have a somewhat limited audience. But but Nuisance, I figured, they came out around the same time Nirvana did, and I figured they were at least as good as Nirvana, if not better. And I think I thought they deserved to be in that same league. I think their tragic mistake with them is that I saw a lot of bands make this mistake. Instead of having full confidence in themselves, they tried too hard to be like somebody else. And especially on Nuisance's second album, you can almost hear them trying to copy Nirvana and be more like them. And I'm like, dudes, Nirvana should be copying you. But that's so, I think that probably stopped them from reaching the full level of greatness that they were capable of. But there's lots of others too, and that deserve to be a lot bigger than they were. But in most cases, it was because they kind of handicapped themselves. Like some bands wanted to only record like really lo-fi, which makes them maybe sound more authentic, but also means they're not going to get on the radio, and that people who aren't used to that rough sound are never going to give them a chance. And there's like the bands that I mentioned earlier who didn't want to be businesslike, who basically just wanted to party and play music. Well, they got to do that, but well, I think probably the Queers would be a good example of that. You know, they're still playing music, or Joe and the current Queers are still playing music, but they had so much talent, and if they had just been slightly more realistic about dealing with their responsibilities, I mean, they could have been like the modern Beach Boys. They could have been like written. I mean, they did write some real classic songs, but they could have written dozens more. They could be like on every radio station and movie soundtrack in the country. But instead, they're, you know, just struggling to get by. And that made me kind of sad. You know, Screeching Weasel, kind of the same thing. Cut themselves off at the knees. Like, they started out as like potentially one of the greatest punk bands ever, and just kind of dragged their asses in. Well, one person in particular kind of just dragged their asses into the dustbin of punk rock history. I mean, they'll always sell a fair amount of records, but not anywhere near what they would have been capable of.
Well, as when you would did you actively headhunt for Lookout? Like, you know, was Gilman like somewhere you'd go and say, hey, I want to see who's opening today, and then what key ingredient?
Gilman was where I went to hang out and see all my friends. And it just happened that a bunch of them were in cool bands, and then it built upon itself. Like, because some cool bands came out of Gilman on the first records that Lookout did, then of course everybody wanted to play there, and so all I had to do was just hang out there with my friends, and all of the best bands in the world came to me. I mean, I could have put out, you know, hundreds more records just based on the bands that came through there. But my criteria for working with bands was not just are they popular or will they become popular. They also had to be nice people, and people that I felt like I could trust and that I could enjoy being around. Is one of the really biggest pain in the ass things about the music business, and one of the things that eventually drove me out of it, was that part of the job is like hanging around with, if you want to be like a really big label, you have to hang around with people that you ordinarily might not want to spend much time with, and you have to kind of kiss their asses and tell them how great they are. Even if you think, well, it'll be popular, even I don't like it that much, but yeah, that's really great, that's awesome, that's amazing. And you can't really lie about it. You have to be somebody that just loves everything that your bands do. I know some of the other people in the business that can do that. I was never any good at that at all. If I told you I liked your band, it meant I really liked your band. And if I didn't say anything, it probably meant I thought you were boring and uninteresting. A lot of bands started getting really annoyed because they thought they had a right to be on Lookout because they're from the same scene, because they're friends with other bands on Lookout. And that became very stressful because, you know, I don't want to just come right out and say, well, yeah, you're just generic. You sound just like bands that we already have and we don't need any more of those. Or you're kind of jerks and I don't like your personality or your attitude or your values. But, you know, or just you're kind of boring. Whatever. I don't want to have to say that to people, but people started pressuring me like, why am I not on lookout? I deserve, I should be on lookout. That's so that was one of the many pressures that built up on me that I'm not trying to blame others or say that's the only thing, but it was one of the things that kind of started to make running a record label not as much fun anymore as it had been. But I may have strayed far away from your original question of how did I find bands, but basically not always at Gilman, but sometimes even smaller shows like almost everybody I think knows the Green Day story where Trey was in our band at that time still, and he said we're going to play at this little cabin up in the mountains, like no electricity. We just have to have a generator, and it's like a high school party. He was still in high school at the time, like in 10th grade, I think. And John from Isocracy, Al, also known as Al Sobrani from Isocracy, I had just joined a new band, and he called me up and said, "You got any shows we can play?" And I said, "Well, I got this new band with these two kids. They're not that punk, but they're really good." And I was like, "Well, the only thing I got for the Lookouts coming up is this high school party up in the mountains. It's like take you 3 hours to get there. I don't know if anybody will even show up, and it's like it might snow and it might get snowed in." And he's like, "We'll be there." And that's how I met Billy Joe and Mike, because they was like their third or fourth show ever, and that's how I like. It was like they played for 5 people in this little cabin by candlelight. And so that's how I found them. I mean, I listened to them for about 5 minutes and I said, well, we're going to make a record with these kids, that's for sure. Stuff like that happened, almost every time that I just happened to be somewhere and somebody was playing and I liked what they were doing, and if I talked to them afterwards and they seemed like good people, well, then we had a record if they wanted one.
Nice. So what was the biggest risk that you took in regards to Lookout, which paid off for you? And what helped you come to the decision to make that risk? Was it a calculated decision or was it more instinctual? So
Somebody once said about the Ramones, is when they started out, they were too, I might have even been me who said it. I think I read it somewhere else though, but they were too dumb to shut up. I mean, nobody liked them at the beginning. They could barely play, and they were doing something that nobody else was doing, and in the 1974, like that was still the era of prog rock, but they had an idea that they wanted to play, and I don't think they were really thinking ahead like someday we'll be punk rock royalty or we'll be famous all over the world or sell a lot of t-shirts, even to people that never heard us. I think they were just like, we want to bang on our instruments and make a lot of noise and have some cool harmonies. And they just kept doing it. They never got really that rich. I don't know if you know this, but the Ramones never had a gold record until years after they broke up. I mean, like literally it was like the late 90s to the 2000s before they ever had a gold record. It was almost kind of embarrassing because we at Lookout had gold records before the Ramones did. But in the sense of Lookout, that was kind of the same thing. I was too dumb to shut up. I thought that my friends' bands were the best thing going around at that time in 1987. And I thought most of the other bands on the radio and then the clubs and stuff kind of were boring and stupid. So to my point of view, like my friends' bands should be really successful. They should be the ones that are in all the record stores and on the radio stations. And pretty much everybody told me, you're an idiot. Nobody wants to hear that kind of music. That stuff went out of style 20 years ago, blah, 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 blah. It's impossible to get an independent label off the ground these days. Punk is kind of like passe. And I was too dumb to not, I was too dumb to listen to them. I just said, well, you know, I don't have much money, but I'm gonna spend the last of the money I do have pressing up some 7 inches, and hopefully I will sell enough of them to get my money back. And if I don't, well, then I'll just be broker than I was before, and everybody will laugh at me, but whatever. And so that was probably the biggest risk right there. I mean, in fact, it was. I mean, it's kind of a miracle that I survived the first year.